I guess I will introduce myself, although you all pretty much know who I am. So I am Leah Benson, and I am a licensed mental health counselor in Tampa, and I have a basically 100% bioenergetic psychotherapy practice. I graduated from FSBA in 2017. Discovered bioenergetics in 2013, about a month before I started the training program. And it was a very exciting introduction, sort of like this that I'm about to talk about today. So I've been thinking that the body was such an important part of making psychotherapy effective and efficient, and that's kind of a theme that comes in here too. So I'll leave it at that. That's very brief little intro to me and my history with bioenergetics. I wrote a book. I was so excited about bioenergetics, I wrote a book about it and combining it with the psychoanalysis that I had personally done. And so yeah, I like to share the stuff that I that I learned. So this is no different.
Thank you.
Yes. And so in October, Gary knows this story. I ran across an article about the idea that emotions are social constructions, and that really kind of struck me. And I was like, I kind of read the article, I skimmed it, and then in I heard the very same day in an exercise class, Gary mentioned something about somebody who had talked about it completely separate from, I had not mentioned this to Gary, but I heard Gary talking about this idea of this woman who was reading it, was researching like emotions as social constructions. And I was like, whoa. So I went back to the article and I read it, and and then I discovered the book that was in the article, and I read it, and it just blew my mind. And so since then I've been sort of being a little obsessional about learning this stuff, because it's such a wonderful sort of dovetail with bioenergetics, and that is in essence what I'd like to talk about today. So to introduce what I like to call the metabolic perspective of mental health, which as I showed in the quote of Reich's that I'm gonna actually read again, even though you guys got it in your emails, that really bioenergetics is based on a pretty fundamentally metabolic perspective of mental health. And okay, so this book that I read, that I learned about from the social media post, is called How Emotions Are Made, and it is the explanation of the theory of constructive emotions. So aside from a sort of introducing the idea of the metabolic perspective of mental health, I'd like to discuss the application of the theory of constructive emotions to bioenergetic analysis, the theory of constructive emotions really being a part of this idea of a metabolic perspective of mental health. So I'm going to go ahead and reread what you got in your email, because it's a nice way to start. So that being said, it is, as Reich said in 1933, to be expected that biopsychiatry will sooner or later succeed in describing human structures and characteristic reactions in terms of bioenergetic metabolism. Such an energetic point of view would enable us to handle, finally, human nature, not with complicated ideas and experiences, but with simple energy functions, as we are handling the rest of nature. So above and beyond what we who practice body-based psychotherapy have intuitively known about the impact of bioenergy on mental health since Reich's time, scientific data now exists on brain structure and processes that support the metabolic perspective of mental health. This perspective indeed enables us to handle, finally, human nature, not with complicated ideas and experiences, but with simple energy functions. So the beauty of this theory of constructed emotion is that far from diminishing the value of the Reichian and bioenergetic concepts of character structure, it clarifies why such categories are useful, the reasons we sometimes have trouble distinguishing between them. It clarifies why we typically attempt to essentialize these categories, and it can allow us to make those character structure categories even more useful in simple but powerful ways as we assist people to build self-awareness, practice grounding and self-expression, and embody the traits of self-possession. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a basic outline of the scientific data on the brain structure. It's really not gonna, it shouldn't be dull. I think it'll flow. So the basic scientific data on brain structure and function that supports the theory of constructed emotion, followed by a discussion of how the concepts of bioenergetic analysis are supported by this exciting new data. Data, it's exciting. The way I've organized this talk is to break down Reich's quote and my own statements into a series of 9 questions. And then I'm going to answer those so as to explain and explore the concepts I've presented. And then I'd like to do, it's a sort of experiential exercise based on the most basic concept of the constructivist theory of emotions, which I'll explain as I go through, and then open the floor for questions and discussion. So before I start answering the questions, I want to say that I find it so cool that recent discoveries about the brain and nervous system not only blur the boundaries between what we think of as physical and mental illness, which they have, but that, I mean, we kind of already, again, intuitively knew that, but it's really cool to have the data. And this theory it goes a long way to making that make a lot of really simple sense. So not only have the discoveries blurred that boundary, but they've also provided the science to support Reich's intuitive idea as reflected in his wishful and prophetic statement. And to be honest, they're not that recent, these discoveries, but in scientific time, I guess they pretty much are. So without further ado, I will begin. All right, number 1, what is the metabolic perspective on mental health? Well, simply put, the metabolic perspective of mental health says that psychological phenomena arise out of the brain's processes to drive behavior and movement in the service of energy regulation. So what that means basically is that what's going on inside of us mentally and emotionally, as Reich prophesied, is actually quite simple and is based on bioenergetic processes. And that's because, as I will explain, psychological processes are inextricably tied to the core job of your brain, which is not to think, not to create, not to contemplate, or any of our lofty human pursuits. It's actually to regulate our energy in the most efficient and effective way possible, which is called allostasis. So in other words, the core job of our brain is to keep us alive. That's it. Nothing else from a foundational biological perspective. Keeping you alive is your brain's job and what brains developed for evolutionarily. That's it. So again, it's really simple. The metabolic perspective of mental health is that mental health is inextricably tied to the brain's most basic function of regulating our body's various systems to keep us alive. So it regulates sugar and hormones and salts and neurotransmitters, and that is to keep everything in balance, keep us alive. Everything else it does is in the service of that goal, including the subjective experiences we have of our mental and emotional selves, like thinking, feeling, creating, contemplating, and perhaps even consciousness itself, sort of coming out of that complex system. So that, it really, I think that's simple. I hope it was simple, like it really, even though I said a lot. So now next, what is the theory of constructed emotions? So moving on from the foundational idea that your brain's core function is to keep you alive, we're going to branch into one of the things that the brain does in the interest of keeping us alive and that interests us in psychology, which is, according to this theory of constructed emotions, which let me just say is a very well supported theory. It's not something fringy or poorly researched. It's astonishing how well researched it is and actually how long it's been around. So what interests us in psychology, according to this theory, is that our brains construct concepts, and emotions in this theory are one type of concept that our brains construct, which I'll elaborate on later. But first, something that's really important in this theory, also this theory of constructed emotions, is that that is very, very different from what we've been taught since brain science kind of filtered into psychology in the 90s, and that is that your brain is one thing. It's a single network. It's not a brain that has sections that do things. It's not a triune brain. In fact, it turns out that the triune brain thing is actually a total myth, or metaphor, we could say, and not at all how our brain works or how it developed evolutionarily. That whole layers thing, total myth. It didn't develop in layers over time. There's a lot of science that backs that up that I'm not going to get into right here, but if you're interested, check out that book, How Emotions Are Made, because everything is explained in there or in the papers that it references. So it turns out, again, that our brain is just one whole brain, and that all the functions, from sensory to cognitive to motor to emotional, they're whole brain processes. They're not processes that happen in a section of the brain. And there's no neocortex. It's not new. It's just a cortex. And that cortex is not our rational brain because, well, there's no such thing. And so, as I mentioned, emotions are concepts, aka ideas, that our brain conjures up kind of on the fly in a particular context based on our past experience that it thinks is going to help us address the situation we're in the most efficient way. Which, even that is not particularly important at the moment, but it is really important. But the important thing you need to know for what we're talking about today is that the theory of constructed emotions is a way of looking at emotions as a completely separate thing from the sensations in your body. In other words, emotions are not specific things in your body or brain. You can't actually necessarily see them on someone's face or in their body, and you can't see a specific one in anybody's brain in a brain scan either, because that's not how our brains work. And I'll get to more about why we think that in a sec. But remember, the science is all in the book called How Emotions Are Made, and the references are in that book as well if you want to dive into it. So the bottom line is this, and it gets a lot more complicated, but for now we'll leave it at sensations are totally separate from emotions, because that's important to where we're going and how this relates to bioenergetics and character structure. So next, what have we intuitively known in bioenergetic analysis about the impact of bioenergy on mental health? So the question kind of answers itself in that what we've known is that it's all about bioenergy. I mean, all the way back, Reich was very intently focused on what was going on in the body, in sensations and breathing, because he thought of emotions as a rabbit hole that would distract from the main goal of helping a person gain the orgastic potency that he was focused on. And Lowen quite frequently talked about depression being a diminished metabolic fire. So even without the current science of brain function supporting a metabolic basis for mental health, bioenergetics was observing the obvious, which is now supported by data. Woohoo! Nice for people who care about that sort of thing. So next, what are the human structures and characteristic reactions that Reich was referring to when he prophesied that, when he made his prophecy? And what are those human structures and characteristic reactions in bioenergetics? What are they from the metabolic perspective of mental health? So the human structures that he was referring to, I'm going to answer this one pretty shortly. What I imagine is that he meant the character structures he developed and their predictable reactions. And so as we dig into this metabolic perspective on mental health, we'll see just how character structure fits in. So those predictable reactions, how those predictable reactions can be understood rather than in a complicated way with this theory of constructed emotion. So now, what are the complicated ideas and experiences that we're currently using to describe human nature? It's a long and varied list, and it probably goes back to the dawn of self-consciousness in humans, really. Although a very popular one that goes pretty far back is the idea of a rational mind and an emotional mind. And given that Reich was a star student of Freud's, I'm sure he was referring to the theories posited by the psychoanalytic community, including his own contributions and perhaps many of the understandings that had come before him. They're all pretty complicated and can get very convoluted. If you studied any of them, and of course we all have, even if only character structure, we know that they're complicated and none of them help us understand human nature simply. It really gets kind of tangled. And it's this idea of human nature fundamentally versus these tangled ideas. So as Reich hoped for in his statement, that to understand things simply, they all just got more complicated, convoluted, the deeper we got into the details. So for instance, like the triune brain with its notions of evolutionary layers of reptilian and emotional and a rational human brain that are actually things in our skull. That's a complication. It's an idea, metaphor. So are the ideas of an animal nature that we have to tame, because none of these things line up with the decades of data that reveals how our brains actually work, how emotions are actually made, or the simple elegance of human nature as revealed by the metabolic perspective of mental health. And so how does the metabolic perspective of mental health explain human nature with simple energy functions? Well, this question brings us back to the basics of the core function of the brain, plus the constructivist theory of emotion that supports this metabolic perspective that I mentioned in the beginning. You have your basic energy level, and then you have a scale of pleasantness to unpleasantness. It's called valence, and that's it. You have energy level and pleasantness or unpleasantness. That is the basic. That's really it. And then everything else aside from that is a construct that can be modified and deconstructed for the purpose of improving mental and emotional functioning anytime we choose. Because every single construct is simply a reality, I'm putting that in quotes, created in a social or cultural context. And it can be changed as long as you want it to, or so long as you can tolerate being at odds with social consensus. In other words, if it helps you function better in life, you can reconstruct your concepts. And we can delve into this later, more later, but in a nutshell, that's how the metabolic perspective of mental health explains human nature with simple energy functions instead of complicated ideas. Which is not to say that our social constructs are not complicated, because oh boy, are they. But human nature is not, and that's what makes this perspective so valuable. So it's energy level and valence, whether that energy level is pleasant or unpleasant, which is a totally separate thing from the constructs that we apply to that awareness, which is basic bioenergetics. So from the point of view of the theory of constructed emotions, what is the value of the categories of character structure, and what is their place in the metabolic perspective of mental health? Okay, so one of the most important facets of the constructivist theory of emotion is that concepts and categories are crucial to our brain's main function, which, as you recall, is to regulate our energy and help keep us alive through allostasis. Character structures, being concepts and categories that help us understand ourselves and others, go a long way towards giving our brain shortcuts. And shortcuts are critical to helping us regulate our energy and stay alive. They do that because they help us create a more granular, more fine-tuned understanding of aspects of ourselves and of the relationships we have, of the world. The more granular our concepts, the more energy saving it is. So because when you break down, you know, the process of energy regulation and staying alive, granularity creates efficiency, and efficiency reigns supreme in the game of metabolic regulation. Very simple. So this idea of having high granularity of emotion concepts is another way to understand what has been termed emotional intelligence in the past, and which is actually valuable pretty much because it helps us manage our metabolic resources efficiently. But to be honest, it's also really practical in day-to-day life because it helps us get along better with people, so we don't have to break it down to allostasis to understand its value, this idea of emotional intelligence. But the truth is, it actually does all boil down to allostasis. And that's, again, why it's like we break it down to simple energy functions, and that's what makes it so simple. Every concept we have, it's like, okay, how do we put this in the mindset of how is this working metabolically? And anyway, I'm going to get ahead of myself. So so many questions to answer. All right, so I'm just so excited about this. All right, so so it's so simple because it all does kind of boil down to metabolic efficiency, which is actually the whole point of this talk. So back to character structure. From this metabolic perspective of mental health, the concepts of character structure provide an excellent way of understanding and communicating a massive amount of information about a person in an extremely efficient way. And so even though it takes a lot of energy to learn those categories initially, the expenditure is worthwhile because in the future, our job at understanding and communicating some fundamental things about how a person deals with the world, and therefore how to help them more quickly, is much, much easier. Which doesn't mean we can make assumptions, because we always have to verify our guesses, obviously, but it means that we are way ahead of the game of reaching our goal of helping people. And that is what bioenergetics is all about. Like, getting into the body helps us really understand and help people. And this application of the simple energy functions with the complication being the concepts, that separation makes things even more efficient and effective. So almost there through the questions. Number 8, how does the theory of constructed emotions help us understand why we sometimes have trouble distinguishing between the character structures? All right. In a nutshell, it's because we like to do what's called essentializing. We like to essentialize things. We want to make them irreducible, to break them down into their smallest parts, like atoms, molecules, subatomic particles. And we like to try to do it with concepts like emotions, as if they can be found somewhere as an essential, findable thing that cannot be reduced. For instance, we want to see it on the face or in a specific pattern in the brain. And we do that because it's metabolically efficient. We like to essentialize as if that's all there is to it. So, unfortunately, that can make us wrong a lot of the time. And so back to character structure. Character structure, in its being a set of conceptual categories, is not different. So like an emotion, a character structure is not a single thing. It's a population of instances. And what is a population of instances? Well, it's the reality that there is not one perfect example of an emotion or a character structure, but that there is always variation. And that idea actually comes from Darwin's observations of animal populations and the variability in those populations. There's always a variation in an instance of an individual population. Or instances of emotion. No instance of character structure is exactly the same, because the contexts within which the character armor of one person developed is never exactly the same as the context within which anyone else is developed. And the physical capabilities one person had during a particular developmental phase were not the same as everyone else had. And on top of that, there's the fact that different people would have likely picked different physical strategies than other people as they defended against the environmental attacks. So the patterns of armoring are always slightly different. And again, variation is always the norm. So even though there's enough similarity that we recognize patterns across people well enough that we can call them a population of instances, they fall they fall into one category, they are never exactly the same. Because our tendency to want to essentialize, because of our tendency to want to essentialize, we all want instances to match a prototype we've learned. But a prototype is simply a statistical summary of all the possible instances that fall into a category. And an essential prototype will never actually exist, even though we want it to. And I think you probably have a sense of this because of the work we've done over the years in body reading. It's never a sure thing, as we all know. And what we gain from this theory is the understanding of why we all want clear categories and how, by understanding this, we can avoid simplifying who people are with our natural tendency to essentialize. And that's important because people are people, not character structures. The boundaries between what we see in a body as a schizoid or oral or masochistic or psychopathic can be very blurry. I think we all know this. And that's because variation is the norm. And so that is what I think, how the theory of constructed emotions can help us with our trouble in distinguishing character structures, and not sort of think that we should get rid of them, that they of course are valuable, but that the idea of a population of instances is sort of freeing from this idea of that they are something essential, and that we do try to do that, and it gets us all tied up. So all right, last question. How does the theory of constructed emotions help us to make the categories of character structure even more useful in simple but powerful ways? All right, so with character structure already being an incredibly powerful concept and a huge reason why bioenergetics is such an effective therapy, as we all know, how can the theory of constructed emotions possibly make character structure even more useful? Well, in my opinion, it makes it more accessible and less stigmatizing. More accessible because no character is an essential thing we're supposed to see and find in a body, but rather a prototype of a population of instances of how people typically manage their energy, and a concept that gives us shorthand in understanding and communicating that information to others as one instance in a population, not as some essential thing. Because let's be honest, the words are stigmatizing. People don't want to own their schizoid, their oral, their maso, psychopathic characters. They just don't. And even people in training programs. I watched it in my own training. I experienced it myself until I really understood it. And I still see now with veteran bioenergetic therapists, putting people into little character structure, astrological signs, and really wanting to essentialize these things and like dial in, and it gets a little, it can get a bit ridiculous, and I think it's unnecessary, because if we look at character structure from the basic metabolic viewpoint, that psychological phenomena arise out of the brain's processes to drive behavior and movement in the service of energy regulation, then we take the stigma out of the characters altogether. Character structures are the visible evidence of noble attempts of a child to regulate the body's energy during a particular developmental phase, instead of shameful categories that conjure a sense that something is essentially wrong with us. Seeing character structure as scaffolding that can be removed easily, as opposed to rebar that is part of a poorly built building and requires demolition to get rid of, is empowering in the process of helping ourselves and others gain the self-possession we're all after. And again, that is what we're all about here in bioenergetics. So now that I've broken it all down, I'd like to introduce a tool that I've created based on this theory of constructed emotions I've called it the Mood and Emotion Tracker. I haven't come up with a good name for it yet, but that's what I'm going to call it right now. So you can see how I've taken the concepts of this theory and put them into practice in my own practice, which is pretty much, as I mentioned, 100% bioenergetic. Some people just won't go for bioenergetic. They won't get up off the couch. They don't want to get into their bodies, but most will. But I created this tool and I started using it with most everyone, because even for those who won't get off the couch, it's a fantastic way to get their minds around the concept of sensation and feeling versus emotions. Because if you can get those two things separate in people's minds, you really put them in charge of themselves in a way that hasn't been possible before, that I have seen or known of. And you give people who don't have a big emotion word vocabulary, you give them a chance to start applying awareness in a way that they haven't been able to in the past, without requiring them to agree with the idea that they're having a particular emotion. They just have to be able to recognize their energy level and whether they feel pleasant or unpleasant. And then from there, we can start to apply the notion of emotion concepts to certain intense mood states. And we can decide if those are the most efficient or effective emotion concepts in a particular context. So that's it. Basically, you have high energy or low energy, you have pleasantness or unpleasantness, and then and you sort of plot yourself. You plot where you are, and you could call that, yeah, I'm high energy and I feel very pleasant. And we could call that, I feel ecstatic, or I feel enthusiastic, or that's one way you could feel. And it does go on from there, and the more intense feelings are generally they come up in a circle on that grid. And that's, because generally when you're sort of closer to the middle of energy, or, pleasantness or unpleasantness, it's just sort of a neutral mood, we might call it. But it turns out that, so Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote the book, How Emotions Are Made, she back in the 80s, with the guy who actually came up with this thing which is called the Circumplex of Affect. When they did their research, they found that it's when you have a more intense energy state, or you're feeling more intensely pleasant or unpleasant, that's where emotion words actually get placed on that grid. And so they make a bit of a circle. And so that mood tracker is based on the Circumplex of Affect. And it really starts with, okay, so where is your mood, energy level, and valence, pleasant or unpleasant? And can you give that an emotion word? And it goes, as I said, goes on from there. Nobody has to agree on an emotion concept. We just have to be able to notice the energy level and the valence we're at. And so that is, that's kind of that. It is, I'm going to repeat Reich's quote that from 1933, "It is to be expected that biopsychiatry will sooner or later succeed in describing human structures and characteristic reactions in terms of bioenergetic metabolism. Such an energetic point of view would enable us to handle, finally, human nature, not with complicated ideas and experiences, but with simple energy functions as we are handling the rest of nature. So I do want to kind of go back and give you, each of you, a chance to kind of like have a look at that mood tracker again and kind of, just kind of imagine, maybe we could talk about that in question and answers, but just to kind of, tell me what you think of that, and, maybe just the idea, maybe you don't, I don't need to go back to, I have, my helper is away from the computer with the, with the slides on it, so I can't back up. But if you just draw that little grid and you think about sort of, you could think about the day, like the first part of the day, where were you on that grid? High energy or low energy, pleasantness, unpleasantness. How did you, how was the overall feeling in your body? Was it pleasant or unpleasant? And was it high energy or low energy? And if you sort of take your day and break it into 4 quadrants. There we go. Hello. All right, so so this mood and emotion tracker, this little circumplex of affect, that is pretty much it. I hope all that made sense, and I want to go over the mood and emotion tracker with you a little more explicitly and open the floor for questions, because I can only imagine that you probably have some. So that is the metabolic perspective of mental health and how the theory of constructed emotions is applied to bioenergetic analysis. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to chatting with all of you about this. So I guess I want to, yeah, I'm curious what you guys heard. Do you have any questions, any reflections, any, would you like to draw a grid for yourself and sort of track where your mood was today and see if there were any emotions attached to that basic mood?
So my data analyst brain was wondering what the thought would be where it would be 0, 0 on the grid.
So very unpleasant and
no,
very...
like where basically you have your X, where your axis starts.
Yeah, that's super. I mean, so that's not actually 0, 0.
Yeah.
The zeros kind of go, they go from unpleasant to pleasant.
Okay, so it's 0 to 10, 0,
yeah,
like kind of, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's not negative. Yeah, and that's my own addition to this graph. That was not on there. I think his name is Russell.
James Russell, you put it on.
James Russell, yeah, James Russell. I don't think he did not put those numbers on there. So yeah, the middle of the graph is just, neutral.
Neutral, okay, gotcha.
And how would you use that? Do you use that in with your patients? Like you start with that? How do operationally, like how's that? How do you apply that to your session?
Well, so basically, people come in with either they are characterizing themselves as, whatever their symptoms are. Their depression, their anxiety, their panic attacks, they're yelling at people, they are, they can't, they can't get to sleep, whatever it is. So what I've started to do is I've basically started to help them understand that everything that's happening to them, if they can actually break it down into this grid, and they can draw a line up and down for how high, what their energy level is, and how pleasant or unpleasant do they feel. And so, for instance, I have a guy I'm working anger management with, right? And so I'm using this thing with pretty much everybody at this point, because every single sort of emotional state people get in can be broken down into what is the physical state that you are experiencing in those moments, and now what are you calling them? And now let's think about let's think about whether the emotion that, let's think about this from an energetic perspective. If you have high energy and you can't spend that energy, well, how's that going to feel? Pleasant or unpleasant? Probably going to feel unpleasant, right? And so because if you have high energy, you have energy to spend. If you have low energy, you need to replenish. You need to take a nap. You need to eat. You need to do something to bring your energy level back up. And so everything we do bioenergetically actually fits into that. So if you start to, again, separate what's happening in someone's body physiologically, sensation-wise, whether is it high energy, is it low energy? And is it pleasant or unpleasant? So what is the context that this is in? And what emotion word are you applying to it? And does that emotion word really serve you the best in this situation? Right? So you could be high energy and it feels unpleasant at the, let me go back to the guy I was doing anger management with. He's able to be aware that his high energy and unpleasant experience in the coffee shop when, you know, the girl has basically not paid attention to him and he just wants to, like, you know, yell at her and make a scene. He realizes that that his goal is to be understood and to have this woman, basically her behavior said to him, like, you don't matter, I'm not paying attention to you. And his expectation was, well, I'm the customer, so I should matter. And so he, by really splitting these two things apart, the anger becomes the story that he is applying to his desire to solve this problem. He wants to solve the problem of being sort of not seen, not taken care of as one might have expected. So it really, every single instance, you can break down into this very clear distinction between what is the energy level in my body, which is almost more important than whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, but that you can say, okay, now what is the story I'm applying in this context, and is that serving my ultimate goal? Because sometimes it does serve your goal to be angry. Sometimes it has served your goal to, you know, respond to something in an aggressive manner because your past history taught you that in that situation, that was the best way to address that problem. And so it's not a matter of like whether it's like your energy level is strong because in your past history, which is where our brain gets the idea of what concepts to apply. It's past experience teaches your brain that. We have a predictive brain based on past experience, which is a whole nother part of this whole thing. But if strong energy is what you have been required in the past to have to take care of a problem, you know, based on your past experience, then that's what you're going to have even at the coffee shop. It's just going to naturally come up in your body. So someone not seeing me means I have to have a lot of energy because otherwise I will not get the result that I'm looking for. Now, of course, that logic doesn't apply in the coffee shop. So you're stuck with this energy and then you just feel angry, like there's something wrong with you. Well, if you can just say, oh, my body is supplying me with more energy than I need to solve this problem, then it becomes less of a like, oh God, there's something wrong with me, and more like, oh, my body has, you know, gone through experience in life that tells me I need a lot of energy to solve the problems in front of me because, you know, whatever the reason was, depends on, you know, the situation. You know, it was usually family, of course, where these things derive, obviously, but they continue throughout our lives. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say that I don't, you know, I feel like I could just probably go on and on, but I'm meandering at this point. So,
well, one, yeah, along that line, just because I think it's interesting. Before I ask other questions, you know, fear is one of those where it can interpret it as being positive or negative, or react to it both positive and negative. And sometimes it can be very overwhelming and sometimes just slight. So that one in particular seems like it might slide around on the 4 quadrants.
They kind of all do, actually. Yeah, that's a really good point. Because you can sit with a perfectly still face and be absolutely furious. And so, as it turns out, what you see on someone's face or what you see in their brain is actually determined by what actions are about to be taken in this instance of emotion.
Could you say that again?
Yes.
I mean, and embellish it a little bit. That's fascinating what you said.
Right. So it turns out that, you know, the sort of sections of the brain that they traditionally assign in classical theory of emotions, that they traditionally assign as emotional parts of the brain, like they're actually motor systems in the brain. They are, and so because we have because we have a predictive brain, which is a piece I didn't really get into, we don't have a reactive brain. We have a predictive brain. Bring me back, Susan. What's the question again? I know I just said something and now I'm off somewhere else with this thing.
Well, you brought up the example of someone that might be very angry, but then you saw their face and it was a completely, you didn't say the word blank, but it did not depict that. And you said it wasn't, and I didn't write it down, I wish I had, but it wasn't what was going on, it was predicting what the behavior would be. Is that what you said?
Yes. Okay, so that, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, right, so emotion, like what you see in the brain when it comes to emotions is not a particular circuit. It is the part of, like, what action is about to be taken to solve this problem, right? So, it's very deeply tied to motor. Like, what are the motor actions going to be? That's where you see the regions of the brain for particular instances of emotion. So it's very tied to motor movement, actually.
Cool.
So the one of the things that, you know, when I read her book that was, you know, most I took as being most positive is, and you said it earlier, it's we can change our story. Even if that story was, you know, armored into our body, you know, we can change that. May not always be easy, but, you know, we can definitely rewrite that story. And that seems like where a lot of therapy, you know, is reinstalling a new program, right? Working to rewire, repattern, whatever you want to call it. You know, a new story, one that hopefully is, you know, more, not only achieving those lofty goals of self-regulation, self-possession, self-expression, but also feeling better, right? Right. A sense of peace and ease. And so, you know, I was just explaining to someone yesterday, this notion of, you know, if you experience your body in a high state of energy and it's unpleasant, or a low state of energy and it's unpleasant, it's often because you are judging yourself for the state of energy that your body is in. Right.
And so, you know, for instance, not having a lot of energy and feeling like you want to isolate, and, you know, now you're depressed. Whereas, you know, you don't sleep enough, you don't necessarily eat like nutritious food, you have kids, you know, drive in traffic, I mean, you name it, you're spending energetically, but you are not, it catches up with you. You're not replenishing, you're not resting, you're not allowing your body to do the recharge part of its cycle. And so you can't move, you don't want to get out of bed. And the reality is that is your body needing to recharge. It's not that there's something wrong with you. You know, that story is, well, that's a story that, as you said, and as, you know, this whole thing is about is no, it's just your body's recharging. And if you have a lot of energy, and that, you know, that's, you have stories in your head that you need to produce a lot of energy in order to deal with people who are, you know, at odds with you, at the in the coffee shop or in your car or wherever. It's that based on your past history, in order to assert yourself, you needed to have a lot of energy at hand, which makes you, you know, an angry person. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's just you have to sort of, and the story you can tell yourself is, oh, my body needed a lot of energy to deal with the people or situations that were at odds in my life, and I don't have to do that anymore. You know, thank you, body, for, you know, but I don't need quite this much energy. And the great thing about bioenergetics is that we have exercises that are specifically designed to bring energy up or bring energy down. And, you know, that's one aspect of the bioenergetic exercise. And another aspect of it is using those exercises to help release the chronic muscular contractions, which hold us in the mindset, because mindset is body set. And that those exercises allow us to, in a practice, release those things and give us new, well, as we all know, new freedom, new flexibility, which translates, because it's all about motor movement. If we're not so restricted, then we don't respond to the world in such a way that we have to be explosive to be, you know, sort of get our energy out there, right? Like there has to be, if we are a contracted sort of, you know, type, masochistic type of a person, then the energy that, you know, we see things outside of the world that are an affront to our autonomy, but at the same time, all of that constriction, it requires so much energy to get the message out and through. So by softening that, and that's an interesting thing about my guy I mentioned working on anger management, that's something that has really it comes to my mind because it's part of what he, in his as his body relaxes, his need to respond with that intensity is not there, because he can sort of make his point without getting, you know, having to sort of burst the feeling through all those layers of contraction.
So the other thing that I've been thinking in terms of the character structures is that they're clues, they're hypotheses for where to start with a person as much as anything.
Right.
You know, and that's the value of it in a therapeutic kind of sense of where to start and what to try.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially when people aren't aware enough to be able to even talk about themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's the idea that it is, because concepts, I mean, words matter, right? Like concepts matter. The words someone say to us can literally change our physiology. The words we use to describe something that looks exactly the same, one that we call a cupcake and one that we call a muffin, just calling those two things, items, something different, makes our body metabolize that food differently. So the words that we hear, the concepts we use, literally change our physiology. And so that this idea of character being the starting point, the hypothesis, I think, I don't know why I had those two things together. I don't know why I thought, I kind of like went from one to the other. Sorry about that. But yeah, I agree with you, Gary. I think that seeing character structure as a beginning point, as a hypothesis is absolutely, you know, like the way to go, and not essentializing and feeling like, I think when we get in training, we want to essentialize, and we really get to this place where, you know, we feel like we should know this person and label this person, and it really gets, it can get to be like the astrological signs, and it doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. I feel like it's such an important piece of, like, initial training is to like
Mhm.
really drive that home, because it's so easy to slip into. So easy to slip into.
The other thing that would be something that I would love to hear reinforced more is where you were saying that, to see the character structures not as like us labeling them and being like, oh, I don't like being, psychopathic structure or what have you, but actually seeing them as, the noble, armor and
Yeah.
scaffolding to try to help you get, survive. Allostasis, actually be able to survive, and that's what you needed, I think, is something that's really that spoke to me a lot.
Yeah. And I absolutely, because what I said there about people not wanting to kind of own their character structure, and this idea that they are stigmatizing. I mean, it really, because I mean, I would be with people in training and, they'd be like, oh, I'm a rigid, I'm like, that's exactly the sort of situation that like, where I feel like we lose the value of discovering the parts of us that are defenses born of those developmental periods when schizoid, oral, psychopathic, masochistic stuff develop. It's like we miss the ability to see ourselves, the stuckness of ourselves in those other characters, if they're a stigma, right? And I just, it's unfortunate. I think it keeps us from being able to get to those things faster than than we're getting to them. And I really think that the stigma is a part of that. It's like, I mean, we can only go as fast as we can go, right? Like, I understand that, and I'm not saying we should make people go faster, but it's the idea that without a stigma of these structures, it's much easier to just say, oh, that structure in me is not serving this situation. And it's really great for certain situations and not really great for others. I mean, the disconnection and dissociation of schizoid is really, really valuable to get through things that like other people can't not pay attention to. And so it doesn't serve in other situations. So
Yeah, to bring it all back to what was it that what is serving you for survival, right? Like, what is it's really interesting to get to that, and really think about it through that lens.
Yeah, and it so the cool thing, okay, so this is a really nice segue to that. I keep referring to our brain as being a predictive brain. So we learn through like seeing statistical regularities, and then our brain like encodes the differences. So with our history, all we see is like certain patterns, and then those get hardwired, and so we basically take those hardwired patterns of learning and we take them out into the world, and then they don't apply. But because it takes so much energy, because learning and moving are the two most expensive things you can do metabolically. And so when you take your patterns that you have learned in your early life, you apply them to everything else going forward, because, well, it takes energy to learn and to like interpret what's happening outside of you differently, to apply different concepts to what you're seeing. All of that is an energetic load. And if you're already under an energetic load, you're much less likely to learn to apply new concepts. And that really is the key to your future being more peaceful and easy. Because without more concepts, you cannot label the sensations in your body as something else. You will only have the ones that you've always relied on. And so it requires an investment of energy to shift. And if you're already like, that's why depression is so awful, because you not have the energy to apply to learning new concepts, to seeing yourself in a new way, to, you know, gaining awareness of how other people in the world deal with, you know, situations in life, you're so depleted that the expense of learning these new things is too much. And so you really have to sort of support the body very fundamentally, metabolically, with sleep and nutrition. And, you know, I mean, I'm going to like bang the drum of the latest thing I've been interested in, which is ketamine, and its value for really helping people lift up out of treatment-resistant depression. So that's a talk for another day. Maybe Susan will let me do that one too. But yeah, learning new concepts is key to having a different, more peaceful and easy future.
The other thing that really struck home to me and from her perspective is, you know, this sort of, I can't know how you're feeling. I can't know, you know, that. And if I say, oh, you look sad, that's really my projection of what I think it means for you, but I really don't know. And acting on that then can cause a lot more problems.
Right, exactly. We can, I mean, if we come from the same, you know, social circles or cultures, we can make some decent assumptions, but they're like you know, they're hypotheses.
Right.
And it's so important to know that it's a hypothesis. Like we cannot even, I mean, we can make a good guess in certain cultures that, you know, a red face, you know, and loud voice in a particular context is anger. Even if the person's like, I'm not angry.
I'm just high energy and unpleasant.
Yes, but in fairness, it might just be feeling excited. I mean, my excitement is often misinterpreted as aggression. You know, I get very excited about things. So I've started to tell people, listen, it might seem like I'm getting like kind of aggressive, but this is kind of what happens when I get excited about something. So don't take that the wrong way, because, you know, certain character types will hear an intense energy as one thing, and other character types will experience it as another. And so, you know, not to use character types like the astrological signs, but it's how much energy can you tolerate? How much energy can you produce? How much energy can you tolerate coming at you without it, you know, being like unsettling? So
I've been playing with the idea of granularity and what Gary was talking about people's stories and using the grid. So just playing around with, you know, I'm low energy, negative experience, so therefore I'm depressed, and asking them to describe, well, you know, let's get more granular with that. Is it depression? Is it just maybe you didn't sleep? Maybe you didn't eat enough? So I'm just wondering how you've used that idea a bit.
yeah, absolutely, just like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and it just really, I mean, speaking of granularity when it comes to depression, it's like that exploration really, really helps people destigmatize the experience of being tired and wanting to be alone. I mean, it's, you know, which is what we need, is for people, like, because it's one thing to be depressed and want to be alone. It's another to feel like something's wrong with you because you want that.
Right.
And so that, again, is the, you know, when you break it down to simple energy functions, to quote Reich again, you know, I mean, it was just, when I saw that, I don't know, I just was like, wow, I can't believe this is so great. Simple energy functions. So we can apply whatever story we want to that. And what stories are we automatically applying that we don't even know? And that's the work, that's the analytic work of therapy, is, you know, discovering, becoming aware of what those stories are that are kind of keeping us in that low energy state or keeping us in that high energy state.
Nice. Yeah.
How can we how can we circle around this simple energy function thing and make this very, very simple? And it's just getting granular.
Nice, well put.
I just love it.
The words that Anna Dea Judith like are charge and discharge. Seems a little more directional than active than high energy and low energy.
Tell me what you mean.
Well, like if I would equate high energy being in a highly charged state,
Sure.
you know, because my body is generating or holding that level of energy. And then in a low energy state, I'm discharged, I'm depleted. And the exercises, you know, that's what they do, right? They charge you up, or they discharge that energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That made me actually think of something, you know, in categorizing these exercises, right? What is it in a charging exercise that is charging in that, because you're, let's just say you're like jumping and shouting and you're spending energy. So why is that, you know, it's like, why is that charging instead of discharging? Maybe because of our intent. The story we're telling ourselves is that we want to, you know, we're going to like tackle this thing. So we're telling ourselves a story that actually gets the cortisol going and brings energy into our body. Just a thought. Apparently people who don't wake up with the cortisol thing that's supposed to happen in the morning, apparently those people are supposed to get on a treadmill or a bike and ride as fast as they can for 1 minute, and that allows that energy to get moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was just saying. It's got to be the energy flow. Yeah.
Right. Anything that gets the cortisol going, I guess. Simple energy functions. That is, it's just astonishing that this lines up so perfectly with that that notion, and that all the concepts of, you know, the analysis and the character structure, they all still fit. I mean, it all fits together on top of this very really simple view.
How do you see how do you understand now in this context then, you know, the Siegel work in terms of mindset and changing mindset?
I think it's changing concepts. You're changing concepts.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that, you know, is striking to me, and this is really coming from my own personal story, you know, a lot of that, you know, the early, you know, impact and survival patterns and defenses that build up, or, you know, protections against your parents and your family. You know, it's the inability to, you know, see that, and what the bioenergetics has given me is the ability to see it and feel it in a way that I can get awareness of it, and then maybe really let it go to help me change this story, right? To be able to shift, to recognize, wow, that is a story. So when my mother, you know, wanted me to be low energy, you know, punished me for being too high energy, you know, I learned to be low energy and not to be seen and that's where it all started, you know, and whatever, you know, words for emotions and feelings in my bodies for emotions still came from our parents initially. And in many ways that emotional story was written by them as much as it was written by me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, once you become autonomous and you can expose yourself to new things, then yeah, it's yours. And that's the thing. It's not, you know, it's not our legacy. It's not our fault. But, you know, now that we're grown-ups, it's our responsibility to add to what we had, in essence, because it doesn't particularly go away, as it turns out. I mean, you know, the whole like state space of a memory is a whole other thing, but those things don't particularly go away, but they are overwritten, and new concepts that are more effective in certain situations become the go-to.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the Kessler, approach, where he emphasizes the gifts of every, character structure, and talks about, you can, as the bad parts become less and less powerful and hold less power over you, you still have the gifts. And
Yeah,
of course,
absolutely.
rename the ones to have less stigmatizing names also.
Thanks, Ron Robbins, for that.
Pardon?
Thanks to Ron Robbins for that.
Yeah.
So what comes to my mind is that it's, the cycle is that there's the compaction until the collapse, right?
Yeah.
And that, for whatever reason, because, the masochist has to hold in, right? They have to hold it. That's it. They have to. That's what the brain is telling them. And so so then the collapse is almost like a dissociative experience that is not something that they can identify with, right? It's a sort of dissociated experience. Like, that's not me. I don't collapse. And so so number one, like, the idea to break the cycle, right? Spending the energy and doing expressive work, being the way to keep the collapse that is a dissociated expression of, whatever weakness or tiredness or what have you, or emotion for some people, doesn't occur, because the practice of intentional letting go has been, enacted again and again and again, right? Which of course is going to seem totally, usually for that person is, and generally is, in fact, my anger management person is a good example. It's just motions, right? And then there comes a moment where that something that they're doing, if they keep at it, like kind of like turns the light bulb on, and they start to, the expressive movements that they're doing really come with a legitimate, like, connected expression of self. But it's like, to break the pattern, there has to be a practice. It's not going to just necessarily automatically happen. I mean, ketamine's good for that, but that's another conversation. But from bioenergetic perspective, is a practice of expressive, embarrassing almost, kind of, expressive letting go movement.
Right. It's so interesting to watch.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, is that any different than what you've kind of been, thought of?
No, I hadn't connected that with this disassociation, more like just an old pattern, a repetition of packing and then collapsing and then packing some more and then collapsing some more, and then go into that, never ending cycle, really. And I remember reading that book, the exercises, the how to deal with masochistic clients and stuff, and how you can just lose your mind with them, because that cycle is so ingrained in there, so heavy, right? And so I'm like, and then so she gives the Victoria that bend into shape, I think. Yeah, it's like she gives like little tips on how not to go crazy when you have a masochist situation.
Yeah.
I mean, how not to punch the person in the face, right? It's so
that would be a little projective identification right there. The expression that they are not doing, you do.
You go and you do it. Come on. Break out of it. Let go, right? What you're saying. But
Exactly. Skydiving is good for them, and so is ketamine. I mean, unless they're going to engage in an ongoing practice of embarrassing expressive exercises, you know?
Yeah. I feel like you have so much more to add. We would need like 3 more hours here.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much to it. It's so interesting. It's 5 minutes till closing time. So, any last questions? Any last reflections?
I have been thinking for a little while, and now this sort of changes it. I kept wondering, is there a homeostasis for those feelings in your body, and then an emotional homeostasis, the meaning I apply, the story I apply. Now, in that context of what you presented, I'm not sure that that's really a relevant idea anymore, because the only homeostasis that matters is the energy function in the brain, and all the rest are the stories meaning I layer on top somehow.
Yeah, there it is again. The simplicity of that is the story I'm applying right now helping me feel pleasant? Is it bringing my energy level to a level that works for this situation?
Mm-hmm.
It's just elegant. It's so simple.
Got to write those questions down. Keep asking myself those questions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, the other side of the things that I've been learning in my coach training. It's, really about living in choice, right? And knowing that I create everything in my world. And then my willingness to accept that I'm creating bad shit too, not just good stuff, right? Creating my own problems that, and willingness to own that.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you guys.
Well, thank you, Leah.
Really appreciate
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, we appreciate your time. You're giving us your time. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan.
Oh, of course. Leah, it was great. You have such a depth of understanding and a very keen capacity to relate everything to what is related to it in this field. So thank you for sharing all of this and all the time and energy you put into preparing the slides and organizing it all and being with us. You have a lot to teach. Thank you.
Thank you. Really glad to be able to do it.
Okay.
All right, guys.